saw an article from you recently in Public Sector Focus that spoke about the upcoming report from the CMA. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
They've been looking at the cloud sector. There's lots of legacy services, software that organizations have been using for decades. Changing that is made hard because of licensing terms, which specifically impose costs on organizations that want to use new cloud providers. That is going to limit that innovative process, and ultimately everyone pays the price for that.
What other things is the government kind of seeing in the future of tech?
I think there's huge excitement about the potential for AI in particular. People are going to need to have the training, the skills, the ability to use these new technologies.
What's the government's plan around upskilling the general population to be able to use these tools?
What was really clear
Hello and welcome to the Cantium Podcast in partnership with Public Sector Focus. My name's Darren Body, the marketing manager at Cantium, and today with me I've got Matt Sinclair from the Computer and Communications Industry Association, the UK side. What we're going to be discussing is legacy software and licensing, AI, the future of tech, where government sees that going, and the kind of skills gap we're seeing in the affordability in the public sector. Matt, thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Can you just get us started by telling us a little bit about you and the CCIA.a.u.k, please?
Sure. I've worked in public policy roles. I've worked in economics roles, and I've worked on the implementation side of tech regulation, and I've worked in government. And I think what you discover so often is that it is an incredibly difficult process often to have a kind of open dialogue where you're going to anticipate the challenges that public policy changes and regulatory changes can create for people, and also that you're all kind of seizing opportunities that are there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, most of my career I've worked as an economist, but always kind of facing off to public policy and regulation and that world. So I lead building CCIA's presence in the UK. CCIA is the Computer and Communications Industry Association. So it's a global trade association for the tech sector, including a whole wide range of companies that operate everything from e-commerce platforms people shop with every day, through search engines, advertising, making software for phones, making software that allows people to track assets, in large public sector organizations. But broadly speaking, CCIA is there to speak to its long-standing mission. It's a 50-year-old organization started in DC in the United States, an active operation in Brussels, arguing for open markets, open systems, and a kind of dynamic tech sector.
Awesome. So those are some of the core principles of the CCIA, right? Those open markets, open systems, those dynamic parts. And so how do you feel like that impacts everything that you and the CCIA do every single day?
So there's a lot of interest in the tech sector and how it's changing society, and how laws, regulations might need to change to adapt to the digital economy that we all live and work in today. Yeah. And doing that in a way which allows the tech industry to continue to innovate, to continue to build and improve those exciting services that both consumers, but also public sector and business organizations use and enjoy. I think there's just a load of vital work to ensure that regulatory change is done well. And I think that CCIA's long experience can allow us to help inform that process, alongside many, many other organizations with diverse perspectives, backgrounds and insights, to try and sort of address some of these complicated issues as ultimately policymakers work through to a decision.
So we'll talk about one of those complicated issues now. I saw an article from you recently in Public Sector Focus that spoke about the upcoming report from the CMA. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the Competition and Markets Authority has been looking at the cloud sector. And I think public cloud computing. So this is where organizations are able to commission anything from underlying IT infrastructure through to software as a service from cloud providers. I think our view is that the cloud sector itself is pretty competitive, that there's multiple large players who are competing, particularly as new business, new operations get built on the cloud. But the problem is that it's not starting from a blank piece of paper. And there's lots of legacy services, software that organizations have been using, in many cases for decades.
Yeah, especially in the public sector.
Well, absolutely, but in plenty of private sector businesses as well. And changing that is made hard because of licensing terms, which specifically make it impose costs on organizations that want to use new cloud providers, but also impede them from deploying that software in the most efficient way on competing cloud infrastructure. And so one of the areas that we're hoping the Competition and Markets Authority will announce action in an interim report that's coming out, this year, will be followed up by a final report early next year, is on those restrictive software licenses. So the Social Market Foundation found that public sector organizations were paying $300 million a year in additional costs because of restrictive licensing terms on just a handful of projects that the think tank was able to look into. But one of the reasons we were really excited to be able to support that research is they also went out and engaged with a lot of public sector leaders about their experience and how these licensing terms were constraining their choice, were creating a friction that was making it harder for them to work with alternative providers. And that impedes competition for public sector business, which will over time, I think, mean public sector organizations get a worse deal. But it also impedes that flexibility people have to try new providers, which might be a better fit for new applications. So as public services work with new technologies, AI being, obviously the really exciting opportunity right now, if they've just got less flexibility to use new providers and work with them in new ways, because you've got legacy licensing restrictions based on the productivity software you might have chosen in a different, what's now almost a different technological geological era. That is really going to limit and slow that innovative process. Which, to step back a bit, the government, facing severe limits on its ability to put more money into public services and really looking for improvements in outcomes, it's going to find that friction, that treacle is going to slow down progress on implementing new technology, which can improve public sector outcomes.
And that's one of the big things, right? Is everyone always says how behind the public sector always is, and it's always due to funding. And if this is one of the biggest things that's stopping them.
Well, you just don't want to have unnecessary friction standing in the way, because these kinds of transformations are hard, right? There's lots of moving parts in adopting new technology in any large organization, and public sector organizations are generally larger, and therefore those complications kind of multiply. And if you layer on top of that people getting stuck in licensing terms, is another friction, and it's going to slow down innovation. It's going to make public services less innovative than they should be and less efficient than they should be. And ultimately, everyone pays the price of that, whether that's the workforce working with more frustrating older tools, or whether that's the public sector public service users experiencing a more frustrating, less responsive service.
Which is probably even more important as a new generation of workers come through that are used to having this technology and the modern technologies that are available to consumers at their fingertips. It's going to be even harder. One
of the things that people have seen happening with the adoption of AI is that, look, there are some big classic programs, right? There might be a problem with radiology screening, and so that you're going to have a program for AI to improve that. But there's also a whole lot of experimentation going on with workers who know how to use this, know they've got a task that's annoying and frustrating in their work.
They know a solution.
And they found a way that AI can help them deal with that, right? Yeah. And then the task is to take those pioneers at the ground level and help scale that. And so, again, you're hoping that this will be as fluid. Again, realistic, change in large organizations is hard, right? But you're hoping this is as fluid and dynamic a process as it can be. And anything which increases the challenge, as these licensing terms do, I think we want to look at and ask whether that is founded on, genuine technical requirements, or which there will be, right? Like every service frustrates its customers in some ways, right? And every customer frustrates the service in some ways, right? But are there unnecessary frictions to improving these services? And in our view, and we're kind of hopeful that the Competition Markets Authority is working on remedies to address this. In our view, restrictive software licensing is an example here. There's lots of countries looking at it, but one exciting thing is the UK is one of the sort of the largest markets furthest along in working out how to address this, which would be great because we were also one of the earlier public service markets to adopt cloud. Yeah. And so it would be great if the UK can be a kind of at the leading curve again.
Digital leader. I agree. Right. So when you recently attended the Labour and Conservative Party conferences, what were they kind of talking about around the new technologies like AI?
So I would say what was really clear was that there's a huge excitement for what can be achieved in public service and a huge sense of need. Of a need to find some way of making progress on sort of public service outcomes and some of the challenges that services are facing.
What might some of those be?
I think workforce challenges would be one. If you're trying to deliver the census and you're the Office for National Statistics, or you're trying to deliver radiology screening, whatever it might be. And there's just only so many people, there's only so many assets. Using those more efficiently, getting more out of the assets available to you and getting more out of the funding available to you will allow you to deliver a better service. I also think there is a recognition that, the government has come in with one of its missions being to realize economic growth. Mm-hmm. And realizing economic growth means raising productivity. We're all going to have to, get more. We can't. There's only so much we can just do more out. We can or want to do more hours, right? You want to get more out of the hours we're working. Yeah. We want to bring more people back into the labour market, absolutely, but we want to get more out of the hours we're working. And that productivity challenge includes the public sector and the private sector. And I think no one who's kind of looked at the UK economy closely has come away and not thought that adopting new technologies more effectively, more quickly, won't be part of the answer. By no means the whole answer, but part of the answer on delivering that improvement in productivity, which matters for public service outcomes, but also matters for business growth and wider prosperity.
So did they give some guidance around that kind of adopting them more efficiently and how they're going about that currently that they could do differently in the future?
I think that there's a political sense of an opportunity here, but I think they are very much working out how they plan to seize that opportunity. I don't think people are coming in thinking they've got all the answers. Okay. One of the things in my line of work at the moment is there's an awful lot of consultations coming out, right? There's an awful lot of, and I do think it's something which it's worth your audience being aware of, right? So at the moment, if there's people in your audience from the NHS, they should be engaging with the government's 10-year plan for the NHS, which very much includes what they've called a shift from analog to digital. Yeah. If they believe that their organisation has a part in wider economic performance and kind of supporting economic growth, which a lot of public sector organisations do, they should look at the Invest 2035 kind of program that the government's working on and currently requesting input around how that can be effective too. And so I think that in terms of the kind of political mood music, I think there's a lot more clarity on where they want to get to than quite how they're going to get there. I think that is where the government, I think, would be open, that they've got a sense. I think they've got a program, but the detail of that kind of needs to get fleshed out, working with businesses, working with public sector organizations, working with kind of trade associations like ours, many expert groups that are out there.
I agree. I think there's a lot more that, especially like the private sector of the UK, can be bringing to the public sector, and it's always being seen to be ahead of the game. Yeah. So working together is definitely going to be more important over the coming years.
And making sure that both sides can work together and understand each other effectively, right? Because it's always hard, right?
Very hard. The public sector often isn't understood by the private sector.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
So we then spoke about a little bit around how the government kind of has an idea of where it wants to get to. What other things is the government kind of seeing in the future of tech?
I think there's huge excitement about the potential for AI in particular. I think there is a broad sense that a lot of services are going to have to shift from a kind of an analog way of working to more digital systems, and I think that it's trying to work out how to do that in a way that will deliver results on a kind of realistic timeline, and minimizing the risks that can kind of come with these programs, because everyone's aware these things have gone wrong in the past, right? And trying to ensure, and one of the ways you try and ensure that it goes right is that the tech sector, there is a diversity in it. Right, that there are multiple cloud providers, there are multiple software providers.
Competition's healthy, right?
That I think that is a reason to be hopeful that public sector organisations are able to make a choice. I think sometimes public sector leaders don't feel that way. I think that was part of where the article was coming from in terms of addressing licensing as one source of that, although by no means the only one. I think there also will be a challenge to bring public sector workforces with this process. There is a risk sometimes that it sounds like, here is how we can replace people's jobs. I don't think that is really the reality of it. I think that there's so much need out there that what it's actually going to be is, how can we get it so you can focus on the bit of your job that's meaningful for you? I think there is an awareness as a workforce challenge more generally, right? Like, the people are going to need to have the training, the skills, the ability to use these new technologies. There's an awful lot of training resources out there. I mean, Google just launched a new certification system. There's schemes within the public sector, but making that work is going to be an ongoing challenge, so that people are kind of able and enthusiastic to engage with this technology, rather than, I think, feeling it's something that's being done to them, which is then, I think, sometimes when programs like internationally have gone awry. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of some of these issues that government's going to have to work through, but ultimately they do see this as a crucial part of how they can deliver better public services, given some of the constraints that they're operating under.
Another crucial part for me really is the skills to use this technology, right? So what's the government's plan around kind of upskilling the general population to be able to use these tools?
So there's a lot of long-standing skills programs, right? I think that there is making those work for AI is going to be an ongoing process, and I think that the private sector, can step up. There's programs run by whether it's Google certification and digital hubs, whether it's like most of the tech companies have some form of kind of training provision. Whether it's within the public sector, which I think ultimately the core of it needs to be, because that's what will be most tailored to the actual jobs they're doing.
True.
Or whether it's in kind of wider external like skills programs, so outside of the organization. You'd also hope it can be an opportunity, right? In that if you can have some elements of these jobs being met by AI, can it make it more accessible for people who might have struggled to be a part of some public sector workforces because there were elements in those jobs they couldn't or didn't want to manage. You'd hope it can be an opportunity as well to bring new people into the workforce. But at its core, it's there's lots of people have tried this. Not a lot of people, I think, so far have found they can integrate it into their work.
I'm one of those, by the way.
Yeah, and I guess the final element, of course, is the systems themselves need to be built, and this is going to be an ongoing process, both within the tech sector but also in the public sector. Needs to be built so that they can be used naturally by people without imposing too great requirement on the public sector. There's an innovation challenge of making sure these things are built in a way that people find easy and accessible, and supportive. And to be frank, a lot of the time working away in the background to improve outcomes, rather than being too demanding of people who have a lot to do in their jobs already.
Yeah.
But all of this all of this is going to vary so much from job to job, from service to service, from application to application. That, obviously we can talk about some of the broad challenges that are going to have to be met. But really, I think the important job for policymakers is to make sure that there is the room for public sector leaders and the tech sector to kind of work together and innovate and work to solutions that will be highly specific to the specific contexts in which it's being deployed.
Yeah, sounds like the private sector can really support the public sector, and perhaps now are the years where we start to see that a bit more.
And vice versa, right? Like the public sector can play a really important role in through its adoption of new tech, legitimizing this, because often the experimentation with this new tech will happen first in sort of digital native private sector businesses, but that is not all private sector businesses, right?
Right?
And I think I think this happened to some extent in cloud. The public sector adoption legitimized it as a route for a lot of private sector businesses that weren't at that kind of bleeding edge of adoption. And so I don't think, and it's also an important customer, right, for tech businesses building new services, whether that's kind of established tech companies or new British businesses scaling up or outright startups. The public sector can have an important role. So I don't think we need to see it as sort of the private sector kind of, comes in, in shining armor, right? Like it is going to be a partnership. And if we get it right, it serves the public sector's needs and helps improve outcomes for users. But it also helps create a healthier, a more competitive, more innovative British tech sector, which supports the wider economy.
That's been a great conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. Great conversation.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Cantium Podcast in partnership with Public Sector Focus, please subscribe wherever you're listening or by visiting www.cantium.solutions.